Great, so you've decided to learn PHP. Before you can do anything useful, you need to learn the basic grammar or syntax of the language. A small amount of time spent learning the basics will more than repay itself in the end, saving you hours of frustration and confusion. Let's start with a broad overview of what PHP is and what it does. PHP stands for PHP Hypertext Preprocessor. It's a rather ugly name for a very powerful scripting language that's relatively easy to learn. You can use PHP in your websites for a wide range of tasks, such as process and email online forms, upload files from a web page, automatically generate thumbnails from a larger image, or watermark them. PHP can also read and write files directly on your web server. And that's not all. You can use it for date and time calculations that take into account different time zones and whether it's daylight saving time. It can change the content of a page depending on the date, day of the week, or time. And one of its most important uses is communicating with a database. Most of the time, PHP is used with the open source MySQL database, but it also works with all leading databases. There's much more that you can do with PHP. But let's not get carried away. We need to start with the basics. When someone visits a website, the browser sends a request to the web server. With a static web page that consists of just HTML, CSS, images, and maybe JavaScript, the server simply responds by sending all the necessary files. However, if you use PHP in your web pages, the server sends the page to the Zend engine that powers PHP for processing before sending the response to the browser. And if a database is involved, the Zend engine is responsible for sending the request to the database and processing the results. All this usually takes only a fraction of a second, so there's no noticeable delay. PHP was designed as an embedded language. What that means is that PHP code is often mixed or embedded in HTML markup. This is a basic feedback form, and it's got PHP commands mixed in with the HTML code. So immediately after this h1 tag on line 23, the following line has a block of PHP code. That's followed on line 25 by more HTML. This is a paragraph with the class warning, and it says, please fix the items indicated. And on the following line, line 26, is another small block of PHP code. So let's see what happens to this paragraph when we load the page into a browser. Paragraph is completely hidden. It's been hidden by those PHP commands. But if I try to submit this form without filling in the fields, let's do that. The paragraph is now displayed, as are these other error messages. But let's take a look at the page's source code. There is that h1 tag, and it's immediately followed by the paragraph with the class warning. Please fix the items indicated. There's no PHP code in sight at all. It's just HTML. That's because PHP is a server-side technology. The PHP code remains on the server, and after it's been processed or parsed, it outputs text and HTML. PHP can look daunting when you start out, but you'll soon become familiar with common features that are used in most PHP scripts. Variables act as placeholders for unknown or changing values. Arrays hold multiple values, rather like a shopping list. You use conditional statements to make decisions, and loops to perform repetitive tasks. Functions and objects perform preset tasks. When using PHP in a website, use the file name extension .php for all web pages. Although you can mix pages with the .html file name extension in the same site, it's a good idea to use .php for all files, even if they don't contain PHP code. By doing so, you can add PHP code later without needing to change the URL. PHP code normally needs to be enclosed in special tags. The opening tag consists of a less than symbol, a question mark, and PHP, without any spaces between the characters. Don't use the shorthand opening tag that omits the letters PHP. It's not supported on all servers. The closing tag is a question mark immediately followed by a greater than symbol. The closing tag is essential if your PHP script is embedded in HTML, but it can be left out if there's no other code following your PHP script. PHP needs to be processed by the web server before the page can be viewed in a browser. So as a rule, you need to store all pages inside the server root folder. In many cases, this is a folder called htdocs, but the name can vary. On some servers, it's called www, www.root, or public_HTML. There are cases where PHP files can be stored outside the server root for security reasons, but that's something you can learn about at a later stage. The need to process the PHP script affects how you view PHP files locally. Don't try to double-click a PHP file in Windows File Explorer or the Mac Finder. It won't work. You'll either just see the raw code or you'll be prompted to download the file. Make sure that your local web server is running, and always view the page using a URL. If you're using a similar setup to me, that means http://localhost/introducingphp/ and that's followed by the location and name of the file within the Introducing PHP folder. So that's a broad overview of PHP. Let's get on with the practical details. Variables are a fundamental building block of all programming languages. Let's begin by defining what a variable is. Put simply, a variable is a placeholder for a value that you either don't know or that might change. If that brings back bad memories of algebra at school, don't worry. We use variables in everyday life without thinking twice about them. Hi, my name's David. What's your name? In this case, name is a variable. When talking about me, name has the value David, but in your case, it might be Ian, Linda, or Harper7. When you go to the checkout in an online store, it tells you the total to pay for goods and delivery. It's a different value each time, but it's always called total. So that's essentially what a variable is. The name of the variable always remains the same, but it can represent different values depending on the circumstances. When creating variables in PHP, you need to follow some basic rules. In PHP, variables always begin with a $sign. After the $sign, you can have any combination of letters, numbers, and the underscore. However, the first character after the $sign must not be a number. There must be no spaces or hyphens, and all variable names are case sensitive. Choosing good names for variables is important. It's best to choose names that tell you what the variable is for. Don't use really short names of just 1 or 2 letters to try to reduce the amount of typing you have to do. It's a really bad idea, except for when the variable is simply used to keep count, for example, of the number of times a loop has run. Similarly, don't use cryptic abbreviations. You might understand what the variable is for now, but if you need to update your script in 6 months' time, you probably won't have a clue. Remember that PHP code remains on the server, so the only people who see the variables are the developers responsible for maintaining the code. Good variable names make your code easy to understand and maintain. Use camel case or the underscore to distinguish between multiple words in a variable name. Camel case capitalizes the first letter of each subsequent word. In the first example, the N of name is in uppercase. But don't forget that variables are case sensitive. If you spell first name all in lowercase, PHP will treat it as a different variable. As long as you follow those basic rules, you can name your variables just about anything you like, with a handful of exceptions. The variable this is reserved for use in PHP object-oriented scripts. You should also avoid using any of the predefined reserved variables listed at this URL on the PHP website. Most of them are PHP superglobal variables. We'll look at superglobals later in this course. So to recap, choose meaningful names for variables. Always begin variable names with a $sign. Use only letters, numbers, and the underscore, but don't use a number as the first character after the $sign. And above all, remember that variables are case sensitive. Using the wrong combination of uppercase and lowercase is one of the most common beginner mistakes. Let's start writing some PHP code to store numbers and text in variables and then display their values in a browser. I'll also show you what happens if you use illegal names for variables. Open your script editor and create a PHP file. I've called mine display_values.php. We don't need any HTML code in this file, so if your editing program has inserted HTML, you can delete it, but the file must have an opening PHP tag. We're only going to be using PHP, so there's no need for a closing PHP tag. So let's create a variable. Variables always begin with a $sign followed by the name. I'm going to call this first name, and I'm using camel case, so an uppercase N for name. We need to give the variable a value, and the value can come from a variety of sources. It can come from user input from an online form, from a database, from an external source such as a newsfeed or JSON, or from the PHP file itself. But wherever the value comes from, you assign it to the variable with the assignment operator, which is simply an equals sign. First name is going to be text, and text needs to be in quotes. In PHP, it doesn't really matter whether you use single or double quotes. There is a subtle difference between them, which I'll explain later in the course, but for now I'm just going to use single quotes, and between those quotes put my name, David, and after the closing quote we need a semicolon. PHP commands always end with a semicolon. Unlike JavaScript, the semicolon in PHP is not optional. So we've assigned the text, David, to the variable first name. In computing terminology, text is always referred to as a string, so the data type of first name is currently a string. But unlike some programming languages, you don't need to specify the type of data stored by a variable in PHP. So we can duplicate this line and then assign a different value to it. Let's assign a number this time, and numbers are not in quotes, so I've now reassigned 42 to first name. So as well as changing the value, I've also changed the data type. But that's not really a very good idea, and first name isn't a very meaningful variable to store a number, so I'm going to change that to number. So we've now got two variables, first name and number. Numbers can contain the decimal point, so we could change this to 4299. The decimal point must be a period or a dot. You can't use a comma for the decimal point, as is common practice in many European countries. Also, you can't use the comma as the thousand separator. So if I change this to 4200 and then try to put in a thousand separator, a comma, what happens in my editing program is that I get this wavy red line indicating that I've got a syntax error. So I need to get rid of that comma. No thousand separators in numbers. So let's just save that. We've got our two variables now, and try to load this into a browser. And although we've loaded the page into a browser, nothing happens. To display the value of a variable that contains a string or a number, you need to use echo or print. So let's go back to the editing program, and I'm going to use echo. Very often you'll see that people put parentheses after echo, and then they put the value that they want to display between the parentheses. Using parentheses with echo is completely optional. It only makes for extra typing, so I don't think it's worthwhile doing. So I'm just going to have my variable, first name, straight after that, and make sure that we put in that semicolon at the end, then save the page and refresh the browser. And this time it displays the value that's stored in first name, in other words, David. So let's see what happens with print. Again, with print, you'll often see people use parentheses and put the value they want to display between the parentheses. Just as with echo, the parentheses are optional, so I'm not going to use them. This time I'll display number, put that semicolon on the end, save and refresh. and it's doing exactly the same. It's displaying the number straight after the value of first name. The main difference between print and echo is that print can display only a single value, whereas echo can display a series of values separated by commas. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back into this editing program here, and at the beginning of line 6 I'm going to insert a couple of forward slashes. That disables the line. This is what's known as commenting out a line. We'll be discussing comments in the next video. What I want to do now is to add extra values to echo separated by commas. So I'm going to put in number first, followed by a comma. You can also have literal text or a literal string. So I'm going to have a pair of single quotes with a space between and then a comma. So echo is going to display number, a space, and first name. And if we save that and reload the page in the browser, indeed, we've got the number, we've got a space, and the value of first name. So that's basically all that you need to do to store text and numbers in variables and then display their values using echo and print. But let's see what happens if you use illegal characters in your variable names. I'm going to come here and duplicate that line, first name, and instead of spelling out first name, I'm going to use the abbreviation 1ST, and as soon as I do that, my editing program objects. It says you're not allowed to do that, but I'm still going to do it, and I'm going to save and then reload the page in the browser. And even though I'm not attempting to display that new variable, I get a parse error. Nothing is displayed in the page except this error message, and it says syntax error unexpected 1. We can't have that number at the beginning. Now, if you're testing this yourself and you've got a blank screen, you need to set display underscore errors to on as described in chapter 1. So obviously, starting with a number after the $sign, that won't work. So let's put 2 slashes at the beginning to comment that out. Then let's just duplicate again, and this time we'll try a hyphen in the middle there. And if we save that, I'm not even trying to display it, I'm just going to refresh the browser. Again, I get a syntax error. You cannot have a hyphen in the middle of a variable name. So again, comment that line out. And let's just see what happens if I change first name here to first name with a lowercase n, save that and refresh in the browser. It displays the number, and then we get this notice, undefined variable first name. It's very important. Variables are case sensitive in PHP. We must have that uppercase N to be able to display first name correctly. The only characters that are permitted after the $sign in variable names are letters, numbers, and the underscore. But letters means not only the 26 letters of the Roman alphabet, it also includes accented characters used in Western European languages. So if French is your first language, instead of first name, you could use prénom. So let's just try that. I'm going to change first name here to prénom, and then I'll comment that line out. And we'll use echo at the end with our new French variable, prénom. Put that semicolon on the end, save, and reload the page in the browser, and it has displayed the value of prénom. So that concludes this basic introduction to storing text and numbers in variables, and then displaying their values using echo and print. Although echo and print perform essentially the same task, my preference is to use echo without parentheses. It's less typing, and it does the job equally well. When working with a programming or scripting language like PHP, it's a good idea to add comments to your scripts to remind you of what the code does. When you come to revise a script after several months, it's a lot easier to read a comment than to study every line of code. The other main use of comments is to disable a section of code temporarily. As well as looking at comments in this video, I'll explain briefly how PHP treats whitespace in code. PHP has three commenting styles, two for single-line comments and one for multiple-line comments. One way to create a single-line comment is to begin with two forward slashes. Everything after those slashes is treated as a comment that's ignored by PHP. The other style of single-line comment begins with a hash or pound symbol. So everything after that is also treated as a comment. Because they're single-line comments, as soon as you move onto a new line, you can start typing ordinary PHP code. So let's create a variable to store my first name. Then if I type two forward slashes after the semicolon, everything to the end of the line is also treated as a comment, so I can explain what this code is for. Then if we create another variable for my last name, and then add a hash, everything after that is also treated as a comment to the end of the line. Now, quite obviously, to create comments to explain what first name and last name are for is a little bit nonsensical, but I hope you get the idea that when you're working with more complicated code, that this can be extremely useful to remind you of what a particular piece of code is for. So those are single-line comments. PHP also has multiple-line comments, and they use the same syntax as CSS. So we begin with a forward slash, an asterisk, then the body of the comment, and you finish off with an asterisk and a forward slash. So those are the three types of comment styles that you can use in PHP. As well as reminding you of what your code is for, comments can also be extremely useful for temporarily disabling part of your code without the need to delete it. So let's just use echo down here for first name. Then on a separate line we'll have a literal space, and then on yet another line we'll have last name. And if I save that and load this into a browser, it displays my name with a space in between. Now that's obviously not the most efficient way to display my name, but I've done it that way to explain how we can comment out these various lines. So on line 14, I can get rid of that space, disable the line by putting in two forward slashes at the beginning, and my code editor has already turned that into a comment. It's changed the color. It's showing me that it's disabled. And at the beginning of line 15, if I insert a hash, the same happens. Let's save that, reload the page in the browser. Those two lines, lines 14 and 15, have been temporarily disabled, and all that's displayed is the value of first name. Now, I needn't have used two separate single-line comments. I could have used a multiple-line comment. So let's just take out that hash and those forward slashes. And then up on line 13, I'm going to create a multiple-line comment. So forward slash asterisk, and then at the end of line 14, I'll have asterisk forward slash. That's disabled lines 13 and 14. Line 15 is now enabled. If I save that and refresh the page in the browser, it displays only the value of last name. So that's how you temporarily disable code using the various types of commenting in PHP. So let's take a quick look at how PHP handles white space. I like to have white space around the assignment operator because I think it makes the code easier to read. But PHP doesn't worry. As long as the code is not ambiguous, you can remove white space. So if I remove the white space on either side of the assignment operator, save and refresh the page, it still works. There's no problem. And we can go in the opposite direction. We can add white space. So I can put in lots of white space after the variable, and I can even go on to several lines below after the assignment operator, and let's go completely mad and have several extra lines until we get to the semicolon. And if I save that and reload the page in the browser, it's still working exactly the same as before, even though it's got this enormous amount of white space in it. And this is very different from the way in which JavaScript works. If you break a statement in JavaScript over several lines, it completely changes the meaning, whereas PHP relies on this closing semicolon to know when it has reached the end of the command. Now, obviously, putting this amount of white space in the code is ridiculous, but it does mean that you can use white space within your code to lay it out for greater readability. So there you have it, comments and the use of white space in PHP. Comments not only make the meaning of the code easier to understand, they also perform a useful role in disabling sections of code temporarily.